For centuries, Native Americans lived across North America in thriving civilizations long before Europeans ever arrived. They built cities, traded across continents, developed governments, cultivated land, and created cultures that lasted thousands of years. But today, most people only know fragments of their story. So how did entire nations lose almost everything? How did millions of people who once controlled this land become strangers on their own soil? And the most uncomfortable question of all, was it inevitable or was it engineered? Because when you look closely at history, you discover something shocking. Native Americans didn't lose everything in one war. They lost it piece by piece, treaty by treaty, disease by disease, massacre by massacre. And by the end of this video, you'll understand how one of the greatest losses of land, freedom, and culture in human history unfolded, and why its effects are still felt today. Stay until the end, because the final part of this story explains something most history books barely mention: how Native Americans were still fighting to survive even into the modern era. Long before Christopher Columbus sailed across the Atlantic in 1492, North America was already home to millions of people. Not scattered tribes living randomly in wilderness like movies often portray. Entire civilizations existed here. Some native societies built massive cities. Others created advanced trade networks stretching thousands of miles. Some had democratic systems that may have even influenced the future United States government. The continent was incredibly diverse. There were hunters in the Arctic, farmers in the Southwest, fishermen in the Pacific Northwest, and powerful confederacies in the East. Historians estimate there may have been anywhere from 5 to 20 million Native Americans living in North America before European contact. And then everything changed. When Europeans arrived, they didn't just bring ships, weapons, and religion. They brought invisible killers. Diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza spread through native populations with horrifying speed. And Native Americans had no immunity. Entire villages disappeared. Some communities lost over 90% of their people within generations. Think about that for a second. Imagine entire cities emptied. Families wiped out before they even understood what was happening. Leaders dead. Traditions interrupted. Children orphaned. Civilizations weakened before most Europeans even stepped foot inland. And this is one of the most important things to understand about Native American history. By the time large-scale colonization began, many native societies were already devastated by disease. But disease alone didn't destroy Native America. What came next was conquest. And conquest was relentless. European powers fought constantly for land in the Americas. Spain, France, Britain, and eventually the United States. Native tribes were often forced into impossible choices. Some allied with European powers against rival tribes. Others resisted everyone. But no matter which strategy they chose, the pressure kept growing. More settlers arrived every year. More land disappeared. More treaties were signed. And those treaties were almost always temporary. Because whenever settlers wanted more land, agreements suddenly stopped mattering. One of the clearest examples was the doctrine of manifest destiny. This was the belief that Americans were destined to expand across the continent from coast to coast. It sounded inspirational to settlers, but for Native Americans it was catastrophic. Because if expansion was considered destiny, then Native people became obstacles. Not nations, not human beings with rights, obstacles. And obstacles were removed. Sometimes through war, sometimes through deception, sometimes through forced relocation, and sometimes through outright slaughter. One of the darkest chapters came in the 1830s with the Indian Removal Act. The United States government, under President Andrew Jackson, pushed native tribes living in the Southeast off their ancestral lands. The Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations were targeted. Many had already adapted aspects of European American society. They built schools, created written languages, established governments, Some even owned plantations and adopted Western farming methods because they believed coexistence might protect them. Didn't. Gold had been discovered in Georgia. Settlers wanted land, and the federal government chose expansion over treaties. The Cherokee Nation actually fought their case in court and won. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in their favor, but the ruling was ignored. And that tells you something important about this entire story. Native Americans repeatedly tried diplomacy, negotiation, and legal resistance. But when powerful interests wanted land, native rights were often discarded. The forced removal that followed became known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands of Native Americans were marched west under brutal conditions. Cold, disease, starvation, exhaustion. Many died along the way. Children, elders, entire families. And here's the terrifying part. This wasn't an accident. It was policy. The government knew people would die. But expansion continued anyway. And if you think that was the end of the suffering, it was only the beginning. Because as the United States expanded westward, conflict exploded across the Great Plains. This is where the story becomes even more brutal. For many native nations like the Lakota Sioux, Cheyenne, Comanche, and Apache, the plains were home. Their lives revolved around buffalo. And buffalo were everything: food, clothing, shelter, tools, culture, spiritual life. But settlers, railroads, and the U.S. Army pushed deeper into native territory every year. Then came one of the most devastating strategies ever used against Native Americans: the destruction of the buffalo. Millions of buffalo were slaughtered, not just for food, not just for profit, but because destroying the buffalo meant destroying native independence. Without buffalo, Plains tribes couldn't survive the same way they always had. And many military leaders understood that perfectly. This was economic warfare against an entire people. And as native resistance grew, so did military campaigns. Battles erupted across the West. Some native victories became legendary, like the Battle of Little Bighorn, where Lakota and Cheyenne warriors defeated General George Custer. For a brief moment, it seemed like native resistance might hold back U.S. expansion. But the United States had greater numbers, more resources, railroads, industry, and endless waves of settlers. Eventually, native resistance was crushed again and again. And this is where I want you to think carefully about something. Most people hear history as isolated events. One battle here, one treaty there. But Native Americans experienced this as a non-stop collapse happening over generations. Imagine being born into a world where every decade your people lose more land, more freedom, and more control over your future. That psychological pressure alone is hard to comprehend. And we're not even at the worst part yet. But before we continue, if you're finding this story powerful so far, take a second to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below with the most shocking thing you've learned so far. Because stories like this matter. And the more people who understand this history, the harder it becomes to ignore. Now let's continue. By the late 1800s, Native Americans were increasingly forced onto reservations. Reservations were often located on undesirable land far from traditional territories. Promises of food and supplies were frequently broken. Corruption was widespread. Starvation became common. And native cultures faced systematic attack. The U.S. government and Christian missionary groups created boarding schools for native children. The goal was chillingly direct: kill the Indian, save the man. Children were taken from their families. Their hair was cut. Their languages were forbidden. Traditional clothing and spiritual practices were banned. Many suffered abuse. Some never returned home. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about identity. The goal was assimilation, to erase native cultures entirely. And when you understand that, you realize Native Americans weren't only losing territory. They were fighting to preserve memory itself. Language, tradition, belief, family, history, all under attack. Then came one of the most tragic moments in Native American history: Wounded Knee. In 1890, tensions were already high among the Lakota Sioux. Many Native people had turned toward a spiritual movement called the Ghost Dance. They believed it could restore their way of life and bring peace. But U.S. authorities feared it as a sign of rebellion. The army moved to disarm a Lakota camp near Wounded Knee Creek. Then chaos erupted. Gunfire broke out, and soldiers opened fire with rifles and artillery. Men, women, children, hundreds were killed, many while trying to flee. Wounded Knee became symbolic of the violent end of armed Native resistance in the American West. But here's the thing most people don't realize: the suffering didn't stop after the wars ended. In many ways, Native Americans entered the 20th century in survival mode. Poverty was widespread, land continued to shrink, political rights were limited, and Native Americans were not even fully recognized as U.S. citizens until 1924. Think about that. The people who originally inhabited the continent had to wait until the 20th century for full citizenship in the country built on their ancestral lands. And even then, discrimination continued. Many Native communities lacked adequate health care, education, and infrastructure for decades. Sacred lands were taken for mining, dams, and development. Native children were still sent to boarding schools well into the 20th century. And stereotypes in movies and media distorted Native identity for generations. But despite everything, Native Americans survived. And that might be the most extraordinary part of this story, because survival itself became resistance. Languages that governments tried to erase are being revived. Traditional ceremonies continue. Native activists fought for legal rights, sovereignty, and cultural protection. And modern Native communities continue pushing to reclaim land, preserve history, and defend their future. But the scars remain. Rates of poverty, addiction, and suicide in some Native communities are still deeply tied to historical trauma. And historical trauma is something many people underestimate. When entire generations experience displacement, violence, cultural destruction, and forced assimilation, the effects don't disappear overnight. They echo across centuries. Now here's where the story becomes even more complicated. Because Native Americans were never one single group. There were hundreds of nations with different languages, traditions, alliances, and conflicts. Some fought each other. Some cooperated with Europeans. Some adapted in different ways. This history is not simple, and reducing it to good guys versus bad guys misses the complexity. But complexity should never erase reality. And the reality is this: Native Americans lost enormous amounts of land, population, autonomy, and culture under European colonization and American expansion. And much of it happened through deliberate policy. That's the uncomfortable truth many people still struggle to confront. Because modern nations often prefer heroic stories. But history is rarely heroic for everyone involved. And understanding that doesn't mean hating America or rejecting history. It means understanding it honestly. Because if we only tell the victorious side of history, we erase the people who paid the price. And there's one final thing you need to understand. Native Americans did not vanish. That's one of the biggest misconceptions in popular culture. Today, Native nations still exist across the United States and Canada. They continue protecting their sovereignty, traditions, and identities. Some tribes operate successful businesses and casinos. Others focus on language preservation, environmental activism, or legal battles over treaty rights. And many Native activists are fighting to protect sacred lands even today. The story is not over, not even close. The real question now is whether future generations will finally learn this history fully, or continue repeating distorted versions of it. Because the loss of Native America wasn't just a series of tragic accidents. It was the collision of disease, expansion, greed, ideology, war, broken treaties, and cultural destruction unfolding over centuries. And once you see the full picture, you realize something chilling. It didn't happen all at once. It happened gradually enough that each generation normalized what the previous generation would have considered shocking. And history shows that when people normalize injustice slowly enough, almost anything becomes possible. That's why remembering this story matters. Not only for Native Americans, but for everyone. Because history is not just about the past. It's a warning about power, greed, and what happens when human beings are treated as obstacles instead of people. If you made it this far, comment, "I stayed till the end" below so I know who really watched the full video. And if this video gave you a new perspective, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear this history. Because the stories that matter most are often the ones people were taught the least. And until next time, thank you for watching.